Hello crafty friends, welcome to day 4 of Watercolour Week. Today we're going to make a birthday card using the wet on dry, wet in wet and glazing techniques. For my birthday card I'm going to paint a birthday cake and I'm going to paint it with 2 shades of pink and some gold metallic watercolour. I'm starting off as usual by mixing my paints so that all my paints are ready to go before I start painting. And I'm using a different brush today. It's called an angle shader brush. It's a bit like a flat brush, but it's got its bristles cut at an angle, as the name suggests. It's a bit like a chisel tip. And this is great for painting straight, wide lines like this. So these are going to be the layers of my cake. And I'm leaving a gap in between each one because I'm going to paint some icing in that gap in a minute. This is where I'm using the wet on dry technique. This is wet paint, runny wet watercolour paint going onto nice dry watercolour paper. I went over the strips of colour a couple of times just to make sure they were all nice and even and level. I touched up the ends with a little brush just to make them look a little less raggedy. And then I used a dry brush to suck up any excess paint from each strip. After that, I dried it with my hairdryer. For my icing, I decided to use gold watercolour, and this pan is one of the ones that came in the Kuretake Zig Genzai Tambi Starry Colours watercolour set. And I'm using a small detail brush to just paint a line of gold in between each layer and on top of the top layer. Next, I take the same detail brush and paint some flower shapes, really rough, scribbly flower shapes on top of the top layer of icing. Once that was dry, I then did glazing, which is a form of wet on dry. So wet on dry is wet paint on dry paper, but it can also be wet paint on dry paint. And I took the darker shade of pink and painted that on top of the dry, lighter shade flowers. This was to create a little bit of dimension and depth. I also did some glazing on the top and bottom cake layers. I ran some horizontal lines across the top layer and I altered the pressure I was putting on my brush as I ran each line across, so that sometimes the line was thick and sometimes the line was thin, and this just gives a bit of elegant variation to the lines. And on the bottom layer of the cake, I put some simple diagonal lines running from one side to the other, again for some variation and interest. For the middle layer of the cake, I pulled out my white acrylic marker and did some random white dots all over it. I dried these really quickly with my hairdryer after putting them down so that they didn't have a chance to suck any of the pink out of the paint and go a light pink colour. I wanted the spots to stay really white, so I dried them really quickly. Then I flipped my card panel upside down so I could paint the candles. I find sometimes flipping things upside down and painting from a different direction actually makes it easier to paint and get the result that you want. So if you're struggling at all to paint something, try flipping or adjusting the angle of the paper and painting it from a different angle and see what results you get. So on top of my gold candles, I painted a little pink heart, just for something a bit different. So that my cake didn't look like it was floating in space, I decided to ground it with a bit of a shadow. So I mixed some indigo paint with one of the pinks to get a violet colour. And shadows are not grey, shadows tend to be purplish, bluish, violetish, and so it can look much nicer and more harmonious if you get a dark colour and mix some of the colours that you've already used on the page with the dark colour to get your shadow colour. And here I'm using the wet in wet technique. So I put some colour down, added some water to it, and then I went in and added more colour to that wet paint. And that just allowed me to get a nice soft blend out of my shadow colour. I also dabbed up a bit of paint because it was a little bit too dark for my liking. And that's something you can do. You can use a bit of tissue paper, a bit of kitchen towel, paper towel to mop up paint, or a dry brush, and that will lift a bit of colour and lighten your paint. So here's the final card. For a bit of a change from the rest of the card in this series, I decided to do a square card. So this is 5.5 by 5.5 inches. And I cut my cake out using a stitched circle die to give a bit of variation. I stamped on the words happy birthday by curving my stamp on my acrylic block and stamping it down. And then I added some pink and yellow enamel dots for a bit of texture and shine. And that's day 4 of watercolour week done and dusted. I hope you've enjoyed the video and that you like the card and it's given you some ideas of things you might be able to do. If it has, do leave a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you've got any questions, comments or tips on watercolour, do leave them in a comment below so that we can all have a read. And I'll get back to you with any answers to any questions. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow. Bye for now.